Israel Keyes is the most perplexing serial killer I've ever run across. Is he America's most prolific serial killer? Is he the most organized? Is he the most wide-reaching? Or is he none of these things at all? Everything about Keyes is a mystery. It's all cloaked in shadow, and the plethora of questions in the wake of all that death he left behind is keeping me up at night. And like all the big mysteries in crime that live rent-free in my brain, I'm going to suck you into this one with me. At least that way, I won't have to suffer alone. Trust me, you've never heard about a killer like this. Keyes is more terrifying than any other murderer we've covered simply because we know so little about him and his victims. Strap in, it's a rabbit hole. Let's get into it. First things first, I'm putting Keyes in the highway serial killer series we have going on. His insistence on using incredibly complex traveling routes across state lines does qualify him for my criteria. Secondly, I'm not going to go in chronological order, starting with the killer's early life and working my way up from there. I know, shocker. Trust me, my organized brain isn't happy with it either. But when police first stumbled across Keyes, no one even knew that there was a killer of this magnitude on the loose, and when they finally realized the level of evil they had sitting in front of them, the scramble to make sense of it all, to build a non-existent puzzle around a phantom, was overwhelming. That's why I'm going to retrace the police's steps instead, so we can unravel this strange killer with them. It all started with the disappearance of 18-year-old Samantha Koenig on February the 1st, 2012. Samantha was working a night shift at a coffee booth in Anchorage, Alaska. Her boyfriend, Levi, arrived to pick her up at 8 o'clock when her shift ended, but he found the place locked up and no Samantha. For hours, Levi and Samantha's father looked for her to no avail. When they received a text from Samantha's phone telling them that she was tired of life and that she needed a vacation, they knew something was very wrong here. The message was worded wrong. This wasn't Samantha typing. And why would a homebody with no money and no car and a perfectly content family life expect to just skip off for a vacation? The CCTV footage they got a hold of the next day showed them the truth. Samantha had been abducted. A man showed up at exactly 8 o'clock just as she was cleaning up for closing time. At gunpoint, he jumped through the booth window and forced Samantha out the back door. He walked her across the street, made her get into a white Chevy truck, and drove off. The man then returned hours later at the same time Samantha's family was driving all over Anchorage looking for her. He'd come back only to retrieve Samantha's purse with her debit card and phone inside. He did not rob the cash register. He did not take anything else, just Samantha's possessions. After he'd texted the family from her phone, a bizarre and cruel game of cat and mouse began, sending authorities running around in all directions. With thousands of Chevys in Anchorage and no license plate to go off of, police, the FBI, and the community could do nothing else but put up flyers, go door to door, and start the grueling process of working their way through the thousands of Chevys on record. Weeks dragged by with nothing shaking loose. That's until Levi got another text. It only read, "Connor Park sign under pick of Albert. Ain't she purty?" Yeah, I know, creepy. And sure enough, when they got to the park, there was a missing poster of a dog named Albert above a trash can, and inside the trash can was a plastic bag. The family was smart enough not to touch it. Instead, they called authorities. Inside was a blurry picture of Samantha with a newspaper next to her with a date of February the 13th, 4 days before the text was sent. There was a ransom note inside demanding $30,000 be deposited into Samantha's debit card. The picture was out of focus, but her eyes were open. Her hair was in an oddly placed braid, something she'd never done with her hair before. But at least she was alive, or so they thought. Police deposited $5,000 into the account, knowing that the kidnapper would have to withdraw it over several trips to the ATM, because he could only draw $500 at a time. And every single time the account was accessed, the cops just missed the man withdrawing the money. The CCTV footage from the various ATMs was nearly useless. He kept his face hidden under a ball cap, sunglasses, and a hoodie so well they couldn't ID him. A month after Samantha's abduction, the card was used in Wilcox, Arizona, 3 times in Texas, and again in New Mexico. This time, the security footage showed another car in the background, a white Ford Focus. Now they were thoroughly confused. The car was different, and it now seemed like they weren't hunting an Anchorage native after all. Who the hell was this guy, and why was he on the other side of the country? Police put out an APB for a white Ford Focus in New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. It was a long shot, but it was all they had, and miraculously, a state trooper just happened to pull over the exact Ford Focus that Israel Keys was driving. Keys was 34 years old, thin, gangly, and unassuming. He had no criminal record and served in the Army. But according to his ID, he was from Alaska, and he owned a white Chevy. And lo and behold, inside the Focus, the trooper found Samantha's debit card, her phone, and a pistol. Now back in Alaska for questioning, Keys was, well, odd. He sat across the table with an air of superiority, knowing he had everyone at his disposal.
I almost feel guilty. Costing the taxpayers a lot of money. But just kept my mouth shut.
My kicks, I guess, was being able to live 2 different lives and have no one have a clue.
Remember, they were under the impression Samantha was still alive, so police were willing to play his game for a while, hoping to get her back intact. But Keys shattered that hope almost immediately. He admitted that he'd killed her, but he wouldn't tell them where her body was until they gave him a Snickers bar, a cigar, and a Starbucks coffee. I'm not even kidding. Keys was an absolute sicko. He reveled in the attention and the ability to order the FBI around like dogs. Upon searching his house, authorities discovered that Keys had a longtime girlfriend and a little daughter. This guy was as vanilla as it got on the outside, yet inside that interrogation room, even the most seasoned law enforcement men got the heebie-jeebies. Keys' presence was one that sent shivers down their spines, yet here was his girlfriend, completely flabbergasted to learn that he'd killed someone. According to her, Israel Keys was an attentive father, a fantastic partner, and as gentle as anyone could hope for. And yet, here Keys was sitting in a gray room with his Snickers bar and his Starbucks, telling them the most horrifying tale of what he'd done to Samantha. He wanted them to hear every detail before telling them where her body was. Wanted to see the horror on their faces before giving her family the mercy of giving her a proper burial. According to Keys, he'd kidnapped her that night, purely on a whim because the coffee stand just happened to be open. No plan, just a desire to kill someone. He then took her back to a shed on the property of his Anchorage home. There, he cranked the radio on high so that his girlfriend and daughter wouldn't hear the screams. After brutally assaulting Samantha, he left her tied up in the shed in the middle of winter in the freezing cold. He promised to let her go when he got back. Instead, he drove back to the coffee stand, stole her purse, and came back, forcing her to give him her PIN number. He then strangled and stabbed Samantha to death and put her body in a box. And here's where the nightmare fuel dials up to 11. Keys booked a holiday for him and his family in the Caribbean for 2.5 weeks, leaving Samantha's body inside his shed. The February cold froze Samantha's body solid. When Keys got back, he decided to turn the heat on to thaw her body out. It was during this process that he got the idea to send her family around on a wild goose chase. When Samantha was defrosted, Keys sewed her eyes open with fishing line, braided her hair, and took his girlfriend's makeup to add some color to her face, to make her look more alive. He then took the photograph of her next to the newspaper, resulting in the message and ransom note that followed. The next day, Keys performed necrophilic acts on Samantha's corpse before dismembering her and dumping the body parts in Lake Matanuska. He drilled a hole in the ice and used her limbs as bait to attract fish for himself. This piece of work quite literally went out fishing, used his victim's limbs as bait, and then brought the fish home so his girlfriend could cook the catch for them for dinner. Authorities found Samantha's remains, exactly where Keyes said she was disposed of. I wish I could tell you that it gets better after this, but Keyes, it turned out, did many more hideous things to other people too. And before we go on, I already know what some of you are going to ask. Nope, his girlfriend didn't have a clue. Police have examined that poor woman 7 ways to Sunday and is certain that Keyes operated alone and without any knowledge of his family. At their home, police found a library's worth of books and studies on serial killers, mass shooters, and authors that wrote about the subject. He obsessively read and reread Dean Koontz's 1995 thriller Intensity, which just so incidentally happens to be one of my personal favorite books. The movie wasn't half bad either. He admired killers like Bundy and Robert Hansen, but resented killers like Dennis Rader for openly apologizing for his murders in court. Keyes considered Rader a coward and a wimp for his weakness and idolized those that showed no remorse, because those were the only people in his life that he'd ever felt connected to. Empty and sadistic, just like him. Authorities were certain that this wasn't Keyes' first murder. He'd been too methodical, too detached throughout Samantha's terrible ordeal. It was like he'd gotten bored, like he'd come to the point that he was so sure that he was uncatchable that he'd started to experiment with how far he could extend the torture, even after the victim was dead. And they were right. Keyes told them he'd done it before, but he wasn't going to give them a single detail until they agreed that they'd give him an execution date.
I want this whole thing done in a year from today, start to finish, basically. If I can't get an execution date within a year, I'll tell you about everything. I'll give you plead guilty to whatever. I'll give you every single gory detail you want. But that's what I want, because I want my kid to have a chance to grow up. She's in a safe place now. She's not going to see any of this. I want her to have a chance to grow up and not have all this hanging over her head. She's going to be fine, but I don't want, and if I end up in in prison for, who knows how many years, 10, 20 years down the road, I know how this works. You're going to keep looking, you're going to keep going back, talking to everybody I've ever been with, from the time I was 20 years old or whatever, and I don't want stuff to keep popping up on the news about me, but I know that if I have an execution date, which frankly, I already talked to my attorney about this. There's no jury.
Don't tell me what you're talking about.
There's
please.
no jury. Okay, I'm talking to you about this. There's no jury in the world or in America that is, if I went to trial on these and got convicted, there's no jury in the U.S. that would not vote for the death penalty for me. I already know that.
When they told him that the justice system didn't work that way and that he couldn't have his wish, Keyes went back to half-truths and cryptic clues, alluding to more victims, leaving crumbs, but no real tangible evidence or outright confessions. All he admitted to was that he'd been doing this for 14 years, but what he'd been doing, with whom, and where exactly, he wouldn't say.
The things I've done, and I didn't do them because I don't feel bad about them, and I didn't do them because I felt I had no other choice. I did them for myself, so it's just as good. It's better, actually, for me to keep them to myself because they're mine. And so unless I'm going to get something in return, aside from just an ego boost by talking about them, then I'm not going to talk about them. I don't have any interest in it.
So the FBI went ahead and investigated Keyes' movements themselves, starting with his child. Here's what they found when they started digging. Israel was the second of 10 children born to Heidi and John Keyes, a deeply religious couple that were members of the LDS Church, or as they are more commonly referred to, Mormons. After deeming the church too sinful for their liking, the pair moved their brood to a plot of land where the family of 12 lived in tents and had no running water or electricity. They attended a church called the Ark, which subscribed to white supremacist ideology. Actually, the Ark is a whole can of worms that we'll get into in a future video. It's a wild and dangerous group of people. The children were barely literate, hunted for their own food, and worked on surrounding farms to get by. But even as a kid, Keys was strange. He'd tie animals to trees and torture them until his playmates began to cry and throw up in disgust. He could never understand why they were so revolted, because little Israel thought the squealing, writhing dogs, cats, and squirrels were absolutely hilarious. By the time he was 10 or 11, the church children ostracized him after seeing him skin animals alive. Look, he wasn't exactly well socialized to begin with. His parents saw to that with their extreme anti-government beliefs. But even for the militant doomsday prepper community around them, little Israel was a dark and twisted little boy that no one wanted anything to do with.
There was one kid that I grew up with, and we used to break in houses together, and mostly like kid stuff. And but then there was a time when I think I shot something. I think it was a dog or a cat or something, and that was too much for him. He couldn't handle it. And so after that, I wouldn't do anything illegal, I guess you could say, with him. Took a piece of parachute cord and tied it to this tree. And parachute cord was about 10 feet long. And I had a .22 revolver with me. And I shot it in the stomach. And it ran around and around the tree. And then crashed into the tree. And then started vomiting. And as soon as that, for me, I didn't really react. I mean, I actually kind of laughed a little, I think, because of the way it was running around the tree. But then I looked over at everybody else, and the kid who was about my age was with me. He was throwing up. He was, really, I don't know, traumatized, I guess you would say. He told his dad about it, and then, of course, his dad talked to my parents about it, and that was pretty much the last time anybody went in the woods with me.
A boy who had a questionable childhood that revolved around ideals of superiority and removing themselves from society created a deeply unsettling individual. Keys might have something missing within him when he was born, sure, but there's no denying that this isolating, hateful, and racist cult that had a hand in his upbringing had a great influence on what he'd become one day. By the time he was a teenager, he'd begun stalking his neighbors, just watching them to get a thrill out of not being caught. He started fires, stole weapons from farmhouses, and sold them to neighbors. Whatever illegal activities he could commit, Keys was all for it. And when he got away with it all, not once was he arrested for burning down people's barns or selling stolen weapons. Keys learned early enough that people did not understand him, so he avoided them.
I've known since I was 14 that there were things that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else seems to think are normal and okay.
Just before he turned 18, he announced his atheism to his parents. They immediately disowned him, threw him out of the house, and forbade all of his siblings from ever contacting him again. That suited Keys just fine. He walked out of that house without shedding a tear. That year, he attacked his first victim, a girl that was tubing on a river. All he could recall was that she drifted away from her friends when he took the opportunity to assault her on a whim. Keys himself said that the attack was utterly vicious, but that he did let her go. He regretted this decision for the rest of his life, not because he felt guilty about assaulting a teenager, but because he'd allowed her to live. He promised himself that he'd never again make a decision so weak ever again.
A Special Olympics athlete with prosthetic feet vanished from Colville while waiting for a ride to church.
Then I went up and down every street in this town and screamed her name.
And there was no trace?
No, there was no trace.
Next, he enlisted in the Army between 98 and 2001. Besides drinking heavily and generally creeping all his bunkmates the hell out, Keys had a very good record. Military life suited him very well. However, the same cannot be said for when he was on leave. He later told the FBI that he'd assaulted 2 college-age women during his service, one in Egypt and the other in Israel. Neither assault was reported, so they cannot be verified. He did say that it was in these 3 years that he made up his mind when he got out of the military, he was going to become a serial killer, But he wasn't going to be like the rest. He would target strangers, different genders, ages, and races. He'd kill them in different ways, and he would never repeat a pattern. He was going to be smarter than any other killer before him. He left service with an honorable discharge and went on to date a girl of native descent, a far cry from his parents' racist ideology. He even had a daughter with this girlfriend. It's his time living on the reservation with her that he learned from the best where the deepest lakes and waterways were. He studied the United States forests and wilderness areas to the point where he did not need directions to travel anywhere in the country. The information was shared willingly with him. On the outside, Keyes was an outstanding carpenter, an extremely knowledgeable handyman that could seemingly fix anything he touched, and he doted on his daughter. He and the girlfriend eventually broke up, so he took his daughter and moved to Anchorage, Alaska, where he opened his own business doing handyman and carpentry work. This is also where he met his new girlfriend, who was still with him when he was arrested. All of this Keyes confirmed when authorities started piecing his life together, but it's here that they hit a dead end. He said that he'd been killing for 14 years. They'd now traced his movements to the year 2002, and if Keyes was truthful about his crimes, then he'd have murdered someone by now. So where were the bodies? Who were these victims he kept saying that he'd killed? Was he just full of crap, hoping to get the label of serial killer so that he could feel important? Or was there actually some truth to it all, like they thought there was? To prove that he was who he said he was, Keyes offered to give them 2 victims, but only if they did some things for him. First, he detested that they accused him of seeking attention, so they were not to put his name in any paper to link him to these 2 victims. And secondly, he wanted an execution date as soon as possible. When they informed him that the executions don't just happen overnight, Keyes was annoyed to learn that he didn't know so much about the justice system after all. But he relented and told them about Bill and Lorraine Currier, a 55 and 48-year-old couple from Vermont that were brutally killed in 2011. They'd been abducted from their home in Essex. Keyes made them drive themselves to an abandoned farmhouse while he held a gun to their heads from the back seat. When they got inside the rundown house, Keyes shot Bill in the head, then assaulted Lorraine before strangling her to death. The house that he left their bodies in was demolished just a few weeks later, and the rubble, along with the bodies, were dumped unknowingly in a landfill. Bill and Lorraine's remains still haven't been found to this day. Keyes definitely wasn't lying. He got several details correct that police had kept under wraps back when the disappearance occurred, including where he'd abandoned their car and which window he broke to gain access to the home. The FBI were floored. This man was supposed to be in Anchorage. How the heck did he go to the other side of the country without them knowing about it? That's because he traveled with the sole purpose of killing people. And when he did, he paid in cash for plane tickets, rented cars, and he did it without record because he ran his own business. He hid kill kits in various states across the country so that he wouldn't have to travel with incriminating weapons on him. These kill kits, as he referred to them, were sealed plastic buckets filled with guns, duct tape, rope, knives, Drano, everything he'd need to kill someone and dispose of the body. He'd take a few days off, drive until he thought the place looked like he wanted to kill someone there, and then he'd bury the bucket. Months would go by, sometimes years before he'd return to a location, dig up the bucket, and then proceed to kill the first person he came across at that location. His victims had nothing to do with a look, a gender, or any physical attribute. That was Keyes' MO. He didn't have a victim profile, like most serial killers do. Nor did he take trophies or write anything down that could incriminate him. Instead, he had a plan, a kit, and a location, and whoever happened to cross his path at that location was his next victim. As much as Keyes fancied himself a unique killer because he had no victim type, he was in many ways incredibly driven by his compulsions, just like all the others. That obsessive preparation, the edict memory of where he'd hidden dozens of kill kits, and the consistent return to those locations. That was his modus operandi. Even those hints and clues he gave which were all almost certainly true, were only on cases that the FBI couldn't prove. The courier's bodies were never found, and he'd left no physical evidence behind. The 3 sexual assaults, none of them were ever reported, so what did they really have? Only the brutal torture and murder of Samantha. Never once did Keyes willingly implicate himself in any murder that could actually be proven outside of Samantha.
Were any of those victims shot? Strangulate. We'll get the whole story eventually.
Keyes did at least lead them to some of the kill kits, and that seriously complicated matters for the FBI. All of the kits were so clean that it was almost unnatural. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace evidence, absolutely nothing. Besides knowing where these kits were, Keyes couldn't be physically tied to any of the crime scenes or the murders and assaults he claimed, outside of a fingerprint on one bullet in one of the buckets. They realized that in 14 years, Keyes had traveled to nearly every state in the U.S. multiple times, hidden dozens of kill kits, and he'd done so without leaving a single credit card trail, travel documents, or records of the motels he slept in. He paid for everything in cash. He'd even gone to South America and Canada on multiple occasions, too. He also owned 2 properties, one in Anchorage and another dilapidated 10-acre property in New York, as well as a small motorized boat that he bought specifically to dispose of victims. They knew it in their guts that he'd committed every one of the murders he alluded to and probably dumped the bodies in the deepest lakes in the country. He started talking about robbing banks and robbing random houses on fire. Police were able to definitively prove that he'd robbed somewhere in the ballpark of 25 banks and confirm the houses he'd set on fire. So at least now, they were able to prove that he wasn't just full of empty air.
Why did he pick these folks?
I didn't. It was just random.
He went on to admit to killing his first victim in Nia Bay sometime in late 2001, as well as a single murder victim in Jersey, another in New York, and then a couple in Washington shortly after that. He did not give names, exact dates, ages, or any defining information, only that he used milk jugs filled with water to weigh the bodies down before submerging them in Crescent Lake near Washington, or burying them in the woods. But the FBI noticed something. Keyes would be satiated for a few months after killing someone, but then he got antsy. On these occasions, he'd drive out to a kill kit, pick it up, rob a bank, or set a house on fire, and then end off his crime spree with a murder. Tracking his movements was impossible. They had no names or dates for victims, but they did have exact dates and locations for the banks he robbed. They noticed that there always seemed to be someone who disappeared off the face of the earth around the same time. Based on this, a few assumptions could be made. In 1996, right before his deployment, Julie Marie Harris, a 12-year-old Special Olympics medalist in skiing, disappeared while waiting at a bus stop. Keyes was living in Colville, Washington at the time, where Julie lived too. Her decomposed body was found in the woods miles away from where she disappeared, while both her prosthetic legs were found even farther away, displayed next to a river. Keyes was 18 at the time, and it was later proven that he'd met Julie at a public pool where they exchanged numbers. Keyes was definitely using the Canadian highways after 2006, mostly for work, and it's been suspected that he might have contributed to the hundreds of women killed on the Highway of Tears during his time there. But when he was asked about killing any Canadians, Keyes said that Canadians don't count as victims, so it's impossible to say who or how many people he might have killed along those highways up north. Deborah Feldman vanished from New Jersey right after a bank heist in 2009. On April 7, 2011, a Jane Doe was found next to a road in Morton, Washington, also during an arson and robbery spree by Keyes. A year later, 58-year-old James Lamar Tidwell Jr., an electrician who disappeared in Mount Enterprise. A day later, during a bank robbery in Azle, Texas, Keyes wore a white hard hat similar to Tidwell's. Tidwell's hair also resembled the long, dark hair of the robbery suspect. When interrogating him, Keyes claimed this wig was made of human hair, When they asked him where he'd gotten it, Keyes replied, "You don't have to buy real hair to get real hair." That couple that Keyes admitted to murdering in New York is suspected to be Cammie Vollendroff, age 16, and Eugene Hyatt, 18 years old. The young couple disappeared from an Oregon beach. Keyes is also the main suspect in a series of 2007 murders known as the Boca Killer, centered around Boca Raton in Boca Raton, Florida. Randy Ann Mallitz Gorenberg was kidnapped and shot to death. A few days later, a mother and her toddler son were abducted from the same area. They were let go after the killer made the mother withdraw money from her ATM card for him. Her description of the kidnapper matched Keyes' physical appearance very closely. Then, 4 months later, Nancy Bocciccio, 47, and her 7-year-old daughter, Joey Bocciccio Hauser, were shot to death in their car in front of a shopping center. Again, these all occurred during times when Keyes was thought to be in Florida. The 2009 case of Deborah Feldman that I mentioned before, who was reported missing right after Keyes robbed a bank, and it's with this case that investigators finally saw his usual superior calm facade crack. They found her case, linked it to the time frame of that robbery, and then found her name on his computer too. When Keyes saw her photo, he became visibly upset, and upon learning that he'd slipped up enough that a search for her name was still on his computer, he became panicked.
Her name was on your computer.
Which computer? Mine?
Yeah, on your computer.
My laptop? Yeah, I don't
That I don't understand.
You don't understand why the name was on my computer?
Right. Well, just explain so we're not sitting here wondering.
No, I'm not gonna talk about what's on the computer. I mean, if you, like you say, if you're gonna go out, there were several legs. I don't know what you want me to.
This had nothing to do with guilt or nerves. Keyes couldn't handle the thought that the FBI were one step ahead of him, or that he'd made such a stupid mistake that they could find her name on his PC. Actually, they found many names that he searched on that computer, all of missing or murdered people. But we'll get back to those in a sec. Keyes was unraveling. The idea that he was not smarter than the cops was an inconceivable reality for him. And it showed in his odd behaviors. They found 11 skulls drawn by Keyes in his own blood on paper in his cell. Then, a few days later, on December the 2nd, 2012, Israel Keyes was found dead in his cell. He'd somehow smuggled a razor blade into the prison and slit his own wrists. Next to his body was a rambling poem ranting about the state of America, distrust for the government, and lamenting about the murders he'd committed, all in full gory detail. I'll put the letter up on the screen for you, so pause if you want to read it. I warn you, it's disturbing. And now we get to the main crux of the situation. Keyes admitted to 8 murders, only 3 of which could be proven, Samantha and the couriers. He drew 11 skulls, but openly said that Canadians don't count, and we have to take into account that he'd been to several South American countries too. Given the awful racist ideals he was brought up on, it's possible that he might not have considered those of indigenous descent quite human enough to count as people. Even if he did have a girlfriend and a daughter that hailed from those people that his family deemed subhuman, it's possible that he didn't necessarily stray as far away from their beliefs as we thought after all. Most likely, he didn't think anyone was quite as worthy as he was anyway. He certainly didn't think that 3 white people he definitely killed were worth living either. Keyes thought he was superior to everyone. Simple as that. So how many people did he kill then? The 11 he drew are the only ones the FBI were willing to accept, because it was at least sort of a confession. But many, myself included, don't believe that's it. Keyes alluded to many things, and too many of them were proven to be true for us to ignore the rest. His thinly veiled clues to Canada and South America, and his uncanny ability to escape detection makes it almost certain that he committed way more terrible things than the FBI will admit. And that's not even counting the nearly 100 names of people who were dead or missing across the U.S. that they found in his search history. Keyes studied serial killers, sure, but he did not study random deaths and disappearances just for the hell of it, so why bother searching these particular individuals by name? Just like his kill kits hidden across the country to this very day, Keyes has victims hidden across multiple countries too. But how many? Is it a dozen? 20? 100? Israel Keyes was unusual in many ways, especially in his secrecy. He was proud of what he did, but considered his victims as his, belonging to him and no one else. He wanted nothing more than to die with a question mark above his head. He knew that the mystery would cement him in crime history. He cared more about that hideous legacy than he did anyone or anything else in this world. But it's the extreme torture and necrophiliac extension of his depravity on his last victim that makes me believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg. No one that depraved and that disturbed could have just jumped into killing at that level. He's been working on his fantasies for years, and he had to have many victims to practice on. It makes me shudder to think what terrible tortures he put them through before he was satisfied. And now you know the drill. It's your turn. Was he full of hot air and only killed those 3, maybe 4 that we know of? Or do you think, like most do, that Keyes took the vast majority of his victims down to the grave with him? If you think that, like I do, then how many were there really? 14 years is a long time to be out there, fueled by gore and lust, to just write him off as another minor player in the grand scheme of things. Like always, remember to like and subscribe. Our team is always here in the comments, taking your suggestions and adding them to our docket of cases to cover. We always take your criticisms and takeaways into account. So don't hesitate to give your 2 cents. And finally, be safe, be vigilant, and I'll see you in the next one, people.